What the overseers did to their favorite enslaved women in secret was worse than torture. The sentence lands like a stone on a quiet table, blunt, accusing, not easily shrugged off. But to make sense of it, we must look at what that stone hit: the ledger itself. Imagine the book open on a sunlit worktable, its pages softened by handling, the edges browned where hands turned them for years, ink that has bled faint halos into the fiber, marginal smudges where a thumb rested. Around it, the tools of everyday administration: quill-stained blotters, a small brass weight that held the page flat, a coin folded into a scrap of paper, become part of the scene. This is not a melodramatic set piece, it is the locus where private life was translated into public fact. The ledger is not simply a passive record. Surviving entries indicate it acted, through language and procedure, to produce new social realities: a reduction in rations, a reassignment of sleeping quarters, the reclassification of a child's status. Over time, those administrative acts hardened into legal and kinship consequences that outlasted the bodies involved. We encounter Amina through fragments. Her name appears, stitched faintly into the inside cuff of a cotton jacket, discovered in a chest of household fabrics. A conservator's note records a faint residue consistent with soap and river mineral on the cuff's hem. A single line in a household book reads, in the hand of a familiar scribe, "Assigned to overseer, corrective assignment," followed by a small tallied deduction. The traces are small, but together they form a pattern. The ledger entry is the point at which an already coercive intimacy is made administrative, ritualized, routinized, and thus rendered permanent in ways that physical violence alone often is not. If this story matters to you, if you want more investigations that untangle how documents shaped daily life and injustice, subscribe and follow this channel. We will return to ledgers, letters, and cloth to reconstruct the lives too often erased. The mechanics were simple and ceremonial. A discovery, sometimes a folded note found in a pillow seam, sometimes an overheard exchange, sometimes the new presence of a child with no acknowledged father, triggered a household choreography. A steward reported to the overseer. The overseer organized a small performance of authority. A minister might be called in to give public sanction. The scribe took up the pen. The language matters. Records across several households include shorthand that scholars have identified as referring to corrective assignment or assigned cohabitation. In the entries, the event is often condensed to a phrase or a column mark, as if a complex moral and social shift could be contained in a single tally. But that compression is precisely the point. The shorthand was the administrative machine's way of converting a private relation into a managed condition. What did an entry affect? The ledger's columns recorded more than words. They registered resources and restrictions. A line might be followed the next day by a change to ration lists. Bread and meat allowances reduced by a fixed portion for the woman in question, while an allowance recorded for house oversight appeared in a separate column. Surviving provisioning lists show the recalibration of food distribution in the days and weeks after a disciplinary note. Sleeping arrangements were altered and documented. Ledger marginalia and a brief deposition paraphrase indicate that an individual moved from a smaller, semi-private sleeping space adjoining the cookhouse to a communal barrack where supervision was constant. Letters that passed through the household were censored. The month's correspondence register, where such things were kept, contains terse rubrics indicating licensed queries only or post-supervised after an assignment entry. And perhaps most consequentially across generations, children's statuses were revised in household lists and in the columns that tracked fosterage, kin recognition, and claims to inheritance. Entries that changed a child's classification from recognized housekin to house charge did more than alter a name on paper. They set that child's social standing for life and, where records carried into legal settings, affected claims to property and social legitimacy. This administrative choreography had ritual elements that mattered to its power. A deposit in a payment book, sometimes a token coin placed beside the ledger, appears in a number of household volumes. Depositions and inspector notes show recurring invocations of the minister as arbiter, less as a spiritual counselor than as a legitimating agent in a public performance. The ritual moved quickly from discovery to sanction to record. Discovery, a token payment or fine recorded, the minister's brief admonition documented in a shorthand line, the scribe's entry that operationalized the correction. This ritual gave a veneer of propriety to coercion. The ledger's columns provided a grammar of social order, and when the handwriting translated an intimacy into a category, assigned, corrected, regulated, that intimacy was no longer merely interpersonal abuse, but institutional fact. Across a cluster of household books, the same shorthand appears, the same procedural sequence, the steward's report, the overseer's note, the scribe's tallied deduction, repeats in entries from different estates and different years. That repetition is essential. One or two entries might be read as anomalies or the misjudgment of an individual steward. A pattern across ledgers is what suggests institutional practice. When investigator Lewis compared marginal codes across a dozen household volumes, he found that shorthand marks and the sequence of columns were consistent in ways that imply instruction or shared bureaucratic culture. Professor Andrews's administrative reading corroborates this. Not isolated offenses, but routinized administrative responses. We must be careful in how we describe what these records imply. The archival traces are fragmentary. Pages are scraped, margins trimmed, folded notes are missing from some volumes, and depositions often paraphrase testimony rather than quoting it verbatim. Where the book is whole, the entry may be explicit. Where pages have been trimmed, the very absence of text is itself evidence. Conservator Amelia's notes are crucial here. In a binding she examined, the book's front edge shows a partial cutting, pages reduced by several millimeters where names and marginalia might once have been visible. Those trimmed pages indicate an attempt at erasure. Where gaps exist, records suggest rather than assert. We say with caution that the pattern shown in multiple intact examples points to administrative routines that were replicated across sites. What made this bureaucratic cruelty distinct, and why the moral claim that it could be worse than torture, is its temporal durability. Physical violence may leave wounds, but it is episodic. It can, in memory and testimony, be witnessable in immediate terms. Paperwork, by contrast, constructs a future. A ledger entry reclassifying a mother's child as a house charge is a formal act that might be cited in bills of sale, in inheritance inventories, in later petitions to administrators. It altered the legal and genealogical map. An institutional designation embedded in accounts and tallies could be translated into subsequent legal adjudication. That administrative persistence carried material consequences. Denied claims to property, exclusion from familial recognition, or formal separation from kin networks that lasted across lifetimes and into subsequent generations. The ledger's power was structural. It made an intimate relation official, and officialness is what made the harm legible to other institutions, courts, registrars, future stewards. Consider the case fragment of Amina. The surviving ledger entry does not narrate a scene. It contains the brief technical note we have already mentioned. Adjacent to it is a notation in a different hand. A small crossed mark that, in other books, appears when a child's dependency status is altered. In a later inventory there is an annotation, no recognized father, charge assigned, that when paired with the earlier line indicates the immediate administrative outcome. We cannot and will not speculate beyond what the evidence supports. The ledger entries do not describe intimate acts. They show a chain of administrative consequence. The cuff with Amina's stitched name furnishes a material anchor. The object shows use, personalization, and residue consistent with river washing, details recorded by Amelia in her conservator's report. A folded scrap discovered in the binding of the same chest contained a short list of names, one of which corresponds to a child who later appears in household roles as a charge. These items, taken together with the ledger lines, give us a plausible reconstruction of how an intimate relation was transposed into bureaucratic control. Administrative measures were precise in their everyday means. Rations were a primary lever. Records from provisioning ledgers show standardized reductions, not arbitrary or capricious adjustments. When an entry indicated assigned, ration rolls often carry a corresponding subtraction the following week. Food, clothing allowances, and small comforts were the currency of daily life. Reducing them imposed a sustained material hardship. Sleeping arrangements are another recorded change. Annotations in housing ledgers and inspector notes indicate movements from smaller, semi-private spaces to larger, supervised dormitories following assignment entries. Supervision was documented in duty rotas and in shorthand notes about nightly counts, mechanisms intended to limit privacy and to make constant oversight a normalized part of everyday existence. Censorship of correspondence further severed connections. Registers of incoming and outgoing letters sometimes bear the later rubric, post-examined, or letters passed restricted. While these notations rarely specify content, their presence signals an institutional attempt to control communication channels, cutting off the possibility of clandestine support, of the exchange of comforting news, or of the coordination that could undergird resistance. The ledger's column was both a trap and a gatekeeper. Once the designation appeared, supervised mail and supervised movement were patterns that could be enforced by daily routines and recorded for reference. Perhaps the deepest and most insidious impact of this bureaucracy is genealogical. In a society where legal recognition often determined claims to property, status, and identity, a ledger's reclassification of children was a powerful instrument. When a child moved from recognized to house charge, that shift made it less likely the child would be acknowledged in wills, less likely to inherit, and less likely to be integrated into a recognized kinship network. The record itself could be cited against later appeals. We do not need to invoke imaginative cruelty to understand the depth of this harm. The procedural labeling of kinship in administrative materials shapes how future hands read family trees, how registrars index names, and how community narratives survive or are severed. There are other ways the ledger produced social fact. Token payments emerge repeatedly in the record as a kind of ritual annexation. A small coin recorded as fine or payment to settle may seem at first a mere accounting method. But when coupled with a minister's notarized presence, that token becomes a publicized transaction, a ritual that turns coercion into a bargain. The payment is often small relative to the cost of a child's maintenance or to the value of labor. Its function is symbolic and juridical. It signals that an arrangement has been reviewed and made legitimate, that there is a paper trail which future officials may consult. The ledger thus becomes the site of moral reclassification, the place where an overseer's private claim is transmuted into a household's formal category. Conservation work has been indispensable in revealing these processes. Conservator Amelia's interventions in the bindings and fabric holdings recovered marginalia and notes that at first glance appeared lost. In one volume, a small folded note, trapped in the spine, turned out to be the only surviving testimony to a sequence of events otherwise erased. Amelia's report notes the presence of stitching that had been intentionally tightened to conceal a name, a small clandestine act of preservation. In another case, she found evidence that the book had been scraped at the margins. The scraping removed what may once have been a marginal remark, perhaps an admonition or a name. These acts of material alteration, both of concealment and of erasure, are themselves part of the archival record. The absence created by trimming is evidence of an attempt to remove traces of administrative actions. That absence must be read as a deliberate move within the archival field to obscure certain facts. The scholar's job is to triangulate the remaining evidence, combining ledger entries, depositions, material objects, and conservator reports, to reconstruct probable administrative procedures without overstating what the fragmentary record can confidently assert. Resistance appears in the record as well, often in small, stubborn, and material ways. Hidden letters found sewn into hems speak not only to secret communication, but to the refusal to accept administrative definitions. Names stitched inside garments, Amina's cuff among them, act as countersigns to bureaucratic erasure, private assertions of identity made to persist even if official documents say otherwise. There are notes sometimes, tucked into bindings that suggest clandestine teaching, lists of letters, crude arithmetic, the beginnings of a ledger of one's own. Where official records sought to reclassify and diminish, these material acts rewrote selfhood, however quietly. Such acts of persistence complicate any narrative that would reduce inhabitants of these households solely to passive objects of the ledger's force. They show moral agency within constrained circumstances, the ways people use the very techniques of administration, sewing, small lists, notations, to assert their claims. But these acts exist alongside the ledger's more durable mechanisms. Resistance did not erase the structural power of the administrative apparatus. Rather, it left traces that required preservation and careful reading. When we place these elements side by side, the ritualized procedures, the material consequences, the archival tampering, the acts of resistance, a particular logic emerges. Bureaucratic violence, unlike episodic physical brutality, organizes a social future. An inked column alters the way institutions and people encounter a person and their descendants. It informs later inventories, shapes how neighbors and registrars assign status, and thereby produces a cascade of exclusion that may be legible in subsequent legal and social documents. The ledger's cruelty is insidious because it is normalized. It disguises itself as routine bookkeeping. It makes coercion look administrative, even reasonable. That is why the moral claim that such practices could be worse than torture rests less on a comparison of immediate physical pain and more on the distinctive, enduring harm these procedures generated. We must underscore what the records do not, and cannot, provide. They rarely detail intimate acts. They do not, for the most part, capture private feelings or the texture of consent or coercion in a narrative form. Where a deposition paraphrases speech, it is often an outsider's rendering, and where a page has been trimmed, we must note the absence. Academic rigor demands we mark uncertainty plainly. Records suggest, surviving entries indicate, the pattern across documents shows. Our reconstructions rest on triangulation, ledgers plus depositions, plus material culture, plus conservators' notes. Each element strengthens the other, but none singly proves more than its limited scope permits. There are ethical stakes in how we tell this story. Historians, archivists, conservators, and public historians hold responsibilities that go beyond describing injustice. We act as stewards of fragile traces of harm and resistance. Our work must honor dignity and avoid sensationalization. That principle guides how we frame Amina's case. We describe administrative outcomes, we analyze patterns, and we foreground the acts of resistance that preserve personhood. We do not invent private conversations or explicit sexual content that the records do not support. The ledger's lines, the stitched cuff, the trimmed margins, these are the objects from which we must construct narrative. The archives themselves are contested spaces. Trimming, scraping, or discarding pages were never neutral acts. They work to silence certain sorts of records. That fact imposes a duty upon us to preserve what remains and to read absences as intentional moves. It also imposes a practical urgency. Conservators such as Amelia have limited resources. Institutional priorities often determine which volumes receive attention. Public history must push against those limits. The ledger that helped produce social harm is often the very artifact at risk. It needs conservation and access not just for specialists, but so that communities can see how such administrative practices shaped their past. What does it mean to recognize these ledger entries as constitutive acts? It means acknowledging that institutions, steward offices, the overseer's household, the ministerial apparatus, did not merely respond to private life. They created social realities through ritualized paperwork. When a ledger changes a child's classification or reduces a woman's ration, that change becomes a fact other institutions can cite. When those facts endure, the harm is more than temporary. It is structural and intergenerational. Acknowledging that structural harm also calls for ethical action. Public historians and conservators are not simply passive interpreters. We have a role in making this material available, in translating the evidentiary cues for wider publics, and in advocating for conservation resources. Practical steps matter: supporting local archives, funding conservator time, digitizing fragile volumes in ways that protect original bindings, and developing community access initiatives that allow descendants and local populations to engage with these materials on their own terms. These are modest but concrete ways to take responsibility for the legacy contained in ledger pages. The ledger demands a kind of moral literacy from us. It asks that we read how administrative language can reconfigure lives. It asks that we notice what was removed as much as what was written. It asks that we respect the dignity of the people who left only a cuff, a folded scrap, a faint tally. And it asks that we refuse simplifications that would turn such histories into spectacle. There are broader implications for contemporary archival practice. Institutional catalogs, the metadata we create, and the access policies we adopt shape how future generations will encounter past violence. The language of cataloging must be precise and ethically informed. When archivists describe entries like assigned cohabitation, they must provide context so that a mere phrase does not become an ahistorical label. Digital surrogates should be accompanied by interpretive notes that explain gaps, trimmed edges, and the uncertainty inherent in paraphrased depositions. Collaborations with descendant communities must be central. Those most affected should have a role in how materials are described, preserved, and presented. The ledger, finally, is a teacher about the ordinary tools of governance. Administrative forms that seem small, a column here, a shorthand mark there, are not neutral. They shape the rules of recognition and belonging. To say that what was done in secret could be worse than torture is not to deny the horrors of physical violence. Rather, it is to point to a different register of harm, one that organizes the future, institutionalizes exclusion, and leaves traces in the paperwork that subsequent authorities read as unassailable fact. There is, within the record, a measure of moral complexity. Individual names appear: stewards, overseers, ministers, sometimes in ways that allow us to see how personal authority and institutional structure intertwined. The archival evidence cautions against easy villainizing of single actors without context. At the same time, institutions are culpable. Procedures, ritualized language, and bureaucratic formats made private coercions legible and legitimate. Understanding that entanglement helps avoid reductive narratives and also directs accountability toward systems rather than exclusively toward individual malefactors. As we close, return to the visual we began with. The ledger on the table. A cuff with a stitched name. A conservator's gloved hands revealing the faint halo of ink. The ledger's pages are fragile, but they are not silent. They speak in the terse economy of entries and tallies. They speak in the absences left by trimmed margins. They speak in the clandestine insertions sewn into seams. Those voices, mediated by the pen and the knife, tell a story of how paperwork produced a social reality that endured beyond immediate bodily suffering. That is the ledger's lesson, and why moral history must attend to both the seen and the erased. If you have been following this reckoning with archival practice and would like to see more work that reconstructs these institutional patterns and highlights acts of resistance, please support local archives and conservators. Consider donating to preservation funds, volunteering time to digitization projects, or simply leaving a comment here about what the ledger asks of you today. Preservation is a communal task. The documents survive by care and interpretation, and care opens paths for restitution, understanding, and memory. In the end, the ledger asks of us what the stitched names already demand: to read carefully, to preserve diligently, and to hold institutions accountable for the ways they translated human lives into administrative categories. The cruelty was not only in isolated acts of force, it was in the slow, ordinary work of paperwork that turned intimacy into a column, a tally, a lasting reclassification. That is why, in the ledger's light, what the overseers did in secret becomes a form of harm whose consequences stretch beyond individual episodes, harming futures, reordering kinship, and institutionalizing exclusion. To recognize and confront that harm is to begin the work of repairing, preserving, and remembering.